It wasn't a direct admission, but Sarah had interviewed enough reluctant witnesses to read between the lines. Bob Whitmore knew his wife was lying, and the guilt was eating him alive. Meanwhile, Karen was at Dr. Morrison's office for her follow-up appointment, maintaining her performance with Academy Award-worthy dedication. "The pain is getting worse, doctor. I can barely sleep at night, and the physical therapy isn't helping at all." Dr. Morrison frowned at her chart. "That's unusual, Mrs. Whitmore. Most soft tissue injuries show significant improvement after 3 weeks of therapy. Maybe you misdiagnosed me. Maybe there's something seriously wrong that your tests missed. We could order additional imaging if you'd like, but..." "Yes, I want every test available. MRI, CT scan, bone scan, whatever it takes. I need documentation of my injuries for the lawsuit." After Karen left, Dr. Morrison sat in his office, staring at her file. In 30 years of practice, he'd developed good instincts about his patients. Something about Karen Whitmore's case bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. That evening, Sarah compiled her initial report for the HOA's legal team. The evidence was building, but she needed more before they could definitively prove fraud. Insurance fraud was a serious crime, and they'd need an airtight case. As Karen soaked in a hot bath, planning her next doctor's visit, she remained blissfully unaware that her house of cards was already swaying in the wind. The investigator, the security footage, her husband's guilty conscience, and her doctor's growing suspicions were all pieces of a puzzle that would soon form a very different picture than the one she'd painted. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin phase 2 of her investigation, and Karen's perfectly constructed lies were about to face their first real test. As Karen sat alone in the conference room afterward, she realized how completely she'd destroyed her own life. Bob would probably divorce her. The neighbors who'd merely avoided her before would now view her as a criminal. Her dream of wielding power over the HOA had turned into a nightmare of legal consequences and social exile. But perhaps most crushing of all was the growing realization that Margaret Chen had been right. Karen had created her own isolation through years of petty tyranny and vindictive behavior. The lawsuit wasn't really about a paving stone or even money. It had been her last desperate attempt to matter, to force people to pay attention to her, to acknowledge her existence. The next morning, Karen stood in her front yard, staring at the infamous paving stone that had started it all. The lawsuit had been withdrawn, but the criminal investigation was just beginning. The local news had picked up the story, and reporters were already calling. Eleanor Patterson approached cautiously from across the street. "Karen," she said gently, "I want you to know that I didn't enjoy turning over that footage, but what you did was wrong." Karen looked at her neighbor, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in 3 years. Eleanor's face showed not triumph or satisfaction, but genuine concern. "Why?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did everyone turn against me?" Eleanor sighed. "We didn't turn against you, Karen. We just got tired of being afraid of you. Afraid of your complaints, your threats, your constant anger. We all just wanted to live in peace." As Eleanor walked away, Karen remained standing beside the stone that had become the symbol of her downfall. She'd spent so much energy fighting imaginary enemies that she'd become the very thing she'd accused others of being, a destructive force in her own community. The question now was whether she could find a way to rebuild the life she'd systematically destroyed, or if her reign of terror had finally come to an end for good. Either way, the perfect lawns and peaceful streets of Meadowbrook Heights would never look at Karen Whitmore the same way again. But as she limped back toward her house, this time, the limp was real, caused by the weight of her shame. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Prison time loomed ahead, and she had a growing suspicion that her fellow inmates would be far less tolerant of her demanding personality than her neighbors had been. The HOA Karen's story was ending, but her reckoning was just beginning. The conference room at Derek's office felt like a courtroom as Karen sat across from Margaret Chen, the HOA's lawyer, and Sarah Vasquez. Derek shuffled papers nervously while Karen maintained her defiant posture, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her unnecessary crutches. "Mrs. Whitmore," the HOA's attorney began, We're prepared to offer you one final opportunity to withdraw your lawsuit with no consequences. Karen's laugh was sharp and bitter. Withdraw? After everything I've suffered? You must be joking. Sarah Vasquez slid a tablet across the table. Perhaps you'd like to review this evidence first. Karen's confident expression crumbled as Eleanor Patterson's security footage played on the screen. There she was examining the stone, making her phone call, looking around conspiratorially, and then carefully lowering herself to the ground. The timestamp showed the entire sequence occurring over 20 minutes, hardly the sudden accident she'd described. This is taken out of context, Karen stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. There's more, Sarah said, producing a thick folder. Medical records showing your pattern of suspicious injury claims over the past 5 years. Statements from your physical therapist noting inconsistencies in your reported pain levels. And testimony from your husband. Karen's head snapped up. Bob wouldn't. He was served with a subpoena yesterday. Apparently, his conscience finally got the better of him. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Karen's rapid breathing. Derek cleared his throat uncomfortably. Karen, maybe we should consider. No. Karen's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand what they've done to me. Margaret Chen and her precious board have humiliated me, ignored my concerns, treated me like I don't matter. I deserved that board position, and when I didn't get it, they made my life hell. Margaret Chen spoke for the first time, her voice calm but firm. Karen, no one made your life hell. You've spent 3 years filing frivolous complaints, harassing your neighbors, and trying to turn every minor issue into a federal case. The board position went to the candidate who actually wanted to help the community, not control it. Help the community? Karen's voice rose to a shriek. You've turned everyone against me. Made me an outcast in my own neighborhood. You did that to yourself, Margaret replied sadly. And now you've committed fraud to try to get revenge. The word fraud hit Karen like a physical blow. For the first time, the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. This wasn't just about losing a civil lawsuit anymore. Fraud was a criminal offense. She could face jail time, fines, and the complete destruction of her reputation. Derek was already distancing himself. I'm afraid I'll need to withdraw as your counsel, Karen. This puts me in an impossible ethical position. Derek's composure finally cracked. Security footage? High-definition video showing exactly what happened on the day in question. Would you like to see it? Derek shook his head quickly. I think I need to have another conversation with my client. Meanwhile, Karen was having problems of her own. Her physical therapist, Mike, had been growing increasingly skeptical of her claimed limitations. During that day's session, he performed several tests that suggested Karen's range of motion was far better than she was letting on. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to recommend that we scale back your therapy sessions. Your mobility seems to be improving faster than you're reporting. What do you mean? Karen asked, suddenly alert. Well, when you thought I wasn't looking, you walked normally to the bathroom, and your flexibility tests suggest minimal actual impairment. Karen's mind raced. The pain comes and goes. Sometimes adrenaline masks the symptoms. Mike nodded noncommittally, but made a note in her file. He'd been doing this job for 15 years, and he knew the difference between someone in genuine pain and someone putting on a show. That evening, Derek called Karen with news that made her blood run cold. Karen, we need to meet. The HOA has hired a private investigator, and they claim to have evidence that contradicts your account. What kind of evidence? Video evidence. The phone slipped from Karen's suddenly sweaty palm. Video evidence could only mean one thing. Someone had recorded her performance. But who? And more importantly, how much had they seen? As she hung up the phone, Karen realized that her perfect plan was unraveling faster than she could patch it together. Tomorrow's meeting with Derek would determine whether she pressed forward with her dangerous gamble or found a way to retreat before the walls closed in completely. But Karen Whitmore had never been one to back down from a fight, even when the odds were stacked against her. She just had no idea how high those odds had become. Karen stood at her bedroom window, watching Sarah Vasquez knock on yet another neighbor's door. For the past week, the investigator had been systematically working her way through Meadowbrook Heights, and Karen's initial confidence was beginning to crack. Who is that woman, and why is she talking to everyone? Karen muttered, adjusting her fake limp as she moved away from the window. Bob looked up from his newspaper, his face grim. Maybe it's time to drop the lawsuit, Karen, before this gets out of hand. Drop it? Are you insane? We're about to be rich, Robert. Rich enough to move out of this gossipy little neighborhood and buy a house where people mind their own business. But Karen's bravado was wearing thin. She'd noticed the investigator's car parked outside their house twice, and yesterday she'd spotted Sarah taking photos of the infamous paving stone. Most disturbing of all, Eleanor Patterson had been giving her suspicious looks across the street, and Karen had a sinking feeling that the old busybody knew something. Sarah, meanwhile, was building a comprehensive case. Her interviews had revealed a pattern of behavior that painted Karen as a vengeful, litigious neighbor with a history of frivolous complaints. Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street remembered Karen threatening to sue over a property line dispute. The family on Oak Avenue recalled her complaints about their children's playground being too loud. Even the mailman had stories about Karen's demands that packages be delivered to her exact specifications. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Morrison's nurse, Janet, had been troubled by Karen's increasingly dramatic symptoms and her insistence on unnecessary tests. During her lunch break, she'd done something she'd never done before. She looked up Karen's insurance claims history. Dr. Morrison, Janet said, appearing in his office doorway. You need to see this. The computer screen showed a pattern that made the doctor's stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, Karen had filed claims for 3 separate injuries: a slip in a grocery store, a fall at a restaurant, and a mysterious back injury at a shopping mall. Each claim had been settled out of court for modest amounts. My God, Dr. Morrison whispered, she's done this before. Janet nodded primly. All soft tissue injuries, all difficult to disprove, all settled quietly. Dr. Morrison immediately called Sarah Vasquez, who received the information with professional calm but inner excitement. The pattern of behavior was exactly what she needed to demonstrate that Karen's current claim wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic fraud scheme. That afternoon, Sarah paid a visit to Derek Spinelli's office. She found him in his cramped suite above a bail bondsman, surrounded by files and the smell of desperation. Mr. Spinelli, I'm investigating the Whitmore claim for Meadowbrook Heights, HOA. Derek's poker face was about as convincing as a $3 bill. I can't discuss ongoing litigation. Of course not. But I thought you should know that we've uncovered some interesting information about your client's history of similar claims. She watched Derek's face carefully as she mentioned the grocery store, restaurant, and shopping mall incidents. His slight twitch told her everything she needed to know. He was aware of Karen's pattern, but had chosen to ignore it. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have security footage that contradicts Mrs. Whitmore's version of events. Karen Whitmore stood in her perfectly manicured front yard, staring at the loose paving stone with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. At 52, she had perfected the art of finding problems where none existed. But this particular stone represented something far more valuable than her usual complaints. It represented opportunity. This is it, she whispered to herself, adjusting her reading glasses. This is how I finally take down that smug HOA board. The Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association had been Karen's nemesis for 3 years, ever since they'd rejected her application to become board president. The humiliation still burned. Margaret Chen, that insufferable woman with her perfectly maintained rose garden, had beaten her by a landslide. Worse, Margaret had actually improved the neighborhood, securing better landscaping contracts and organizing popular community events. Karen's vision of iron-fisted rule over every blade of grass and fence post color had been crushed. But now, as she stared at the slightly raised edge of the walkway stone, Karen saw her redemption. She pulled out her phone and called her lawyer, Derek Spinelli, a man whose ethics were as flexible as his hourly rates. Derek, it's Karen. I need you to come over immediately. I've had an accident. What kind of accident? Derek's voice carried that familiar tone of weary resignation. The kind that's going to cost the HOA everything they've got. 20 minutes later, Derek arrived to find Karen lying dramatically beside the offending stone, her leg bent at what she hoped was a convincing angle. Her husband, Bob, stood nearby looking confused and uncomfortable. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" Bob muttered, his mustache twitching with embarrassment. "I'm securing our financial future, Robert. Now shut up and look concerned." Derek knelt beside her, his practiced eye already calculating potential settlements. "What happened?" "I was walking to get the mail when I tripped on this death trap of a paving stone. My ankle is definitely broken, maybe my leg too. The pain is excruciating." Karen winced theatrically. "The mailbox is in the other direction," Bob pointed out unhelpfully. Karen shot him a look that could have melted steel. "I was taking the scenic route." Derek helped her to her feet, noting how she carefully favored her injured leg. "We'll need medical documentation, witness statements, photos of the hazard." "Already taken care of," Karen interrupted, pulling out her phone to show dozens of photos of the stone from every conceivable angle. "I've been documenting this safety hazard for weeks. The HOA's negligence is crystal clear." What Karen didn't notice was Mrs. Patterson from across the street, watering her petunias and watching the entire performance with growing suspicion. Eleanor Patterson had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 30 years and had developed a keen eye for neighborhood drama. Something about Karen's theatrical display didn't sit right. As the ambulance Derek had called arrived, Karen allowed herself a small smile of triumph. By tomorrow, the entire HOA board would know they were facing a lawsuit that could bankrupt the association. Margaret Chen's perfect little kingdom was about to crumble, and Karen would finally get the respect she deserved. "Don't worry, ma'am," the EMT said as they loaded her onto the stretcher. "We'll take good care of you." "Oh, I'm counting on it," Karen replied, her voice carrying a hint of something that made the young paramedic pause. But he shrugged it off and closed the ambulance doors. As they drove away, Eleanor Patterson made a mental note to check her security cameras. Something told her this story was far from over. 2 days later, Karen sat in Dr. Morrison's office, her ankle wrapped in an unnecessarily bulky bandage. The emergency room visit had been a masterclass in performance art. Shade insisted on X-rays, MRIs, and every test she could think of to build her medical case. The fact that none of them showed actual injury was, in her mind, irrelevant. Soft tissue damage was notoriously hard to prove. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have to say, your tests are remarkably clear," Dr. Morrison said, frowning at the results. "There's no sign of fracture, ligament damage, or significant swelling." "Doctor, I'm in agony," Karen replied, her voice trembling with practiced pain. "Just because your machines can't see it doesn't mean I'm not suffering. I can barely walk." Dr. Morrison, a kind man nearing retirement, had seen his share of questionable injuries over the years, but Karen's performance was convincing enough, and he wasn't about to accuse a patient of lying. "Well, soft tissue injuries can be tricky. I'll prescribe some pain medication and physical therapy. Take it easy for the next few weeks." "Weeks?" Karen's eyes lit up. "Doctor, you don't understand. This could take months to heal properly. Maybe longer." As she left the medical center on her brand new crutches, Karen felt a surge of vindication. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the fun part. She called Derek from her car. "It's official. Dr. Morrison says I could be disabled for months. Chronic pain, possible permanent damage. I want you to file that lawsuit today." "Karen, are you sure about this? If they investigate, let them investigate. I have medical records, photos, witnesses." "What witnesses?" Karen paused. In her excitement, she'd forgotten that small detail. "I'll find witnesses. Half the neighborhood saw that dangerous stone. Someone must have seen me fall." But as Karen drove through Meadowbrook Heights, she realized finding cooperative witnesses might be harder than expected. Most of her neighbors actively avoided her after years of complaints about everything from their mailbox placement to their children's chalk drawings. She'd made enemies of nearly everyone in the subdivision, That evening, Karen sat at her kitchen table, crafting her narrative. She'd fallen at exactly 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday while walking to check her mailbox. She'd been wearing her comfortable walking shoes, the ones she'd conveniently thrown away that morning. The pain had been immediate and severe. She'd called for help, but no one had heard her cries. Bob watched her scribbling notes with growing unease. "Karen, this is crazy. What if they find out you're lying?" "I'm not lying, Robert. I did fall. The fact that I may have orchestrated the timing doesn't change the fundamental truth that the HOA's negligence created a hazardous condition. You threw yourself down next to a perfectly safe paving stone." "Keep your voice down," Karen hissed, glancing toward the windows. "And it wasn't perfectly safe. It was raised at least a quarter inch. In some lighting conditions, that could be nearly invisible." Meanwhile, across the street, Eleanor Patterson was reviewing footage from her doorbell camera. She'd installed the system 6 months ago after a rash of package thefts, and it had an excellent view of Karen's front walkway. What she saw made her sit back in her chair with a low whistle. The footage clearly showed Karen examining the stone, taking photos, making a phone call, and then, after looking around to make sure no one was watching, carefully positioning herself on the ground. There was no fall, no trip, no accident of any kind. Eleanor reached for her phone, then hesitated. Getting involved in neighborhood drama wasn't her style, but something about Karen's brazen deception struck her as fundamentally wrong. The HOA budget came from everyone's dues. If Karen won her fraudulent lawsuit, every homeowner in Meadowbrook Heights would pay the price through increased fees or special assessments. She made her decision and dialed Margaret Chen's number. "Margaret, it's Eleanor Patterson. We need to talk about Karen Whitmore's so-called accident, and you're going to want to see what I have on video." As Karen continued crafting her fictional narrative late into the night, she had no idea that her carefully constructed plan was already beginning to unravel. The web of lies she was weaving would soon trap her in ways she never imagined. 3 weeks later, Karen sat in Derek's office, reviewing the lawsuit papers with the satisfaction of a chess master contemplating checkmate. The document was a thing of beauty. 12 pages of legal language demanding $500,000 in damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, lost wages, and emotional distress caused by the HOA's gross negligence in maintaining safe walkways. "This is perfect, Derek. They'll settle within a month rather than face the publicity nightmare of a trial." Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Karen, I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about your version of events? Because once we file this, there's no going back." "My version?" Karen's voice rose dangerously. "Are you questioning my integrity?" "It's just that HOA lawsuits get scrutinized pretty heavily. They'll hire investigators, interview neighbors, maybe even check security cameras. Let them. I have nothing to hide." Karen's confidence was unshakable. She'd spent 3 weeks perfecting her story, timing her recovery to be just low enough to suggest serious injury, but not so dramatic as to require surgery. She'd even started seeing Dr. Patterson's physical therapist twice a week, complaining bitterly about her persistent pain. What Karen didn't know was that the HOA board had indeed hired an investigator, a sharp-eyed former police detective named Sarah Vasquez, who specialized in insurance fraud. Margaret Chen had been suspicious from the moment she received the lawsuit papers, especially after Eleanor Patterson's disturbing phone call about the security footage. That same afternoon, as Karen limped dramatically into her physical therapy appointment, Sarah was canvassing the neighborhood. Her first stop was Eleanor Patterson's house. "I've never seen anything like it," Eleanor said, showing Sarah the doorbell camera footage on her tablet. She examined that stone like she was planning something, then just laid down beside it and started screaming. Sarah watched the footage 3 times, making notes. "This is excellent evidence, Mrs. Patterson, but we'll need the original file and your testimony if this goes to trial." "Absolutely. I've lived here 30 years, and I've never seen such outrageous behavior. That woman has terrorized this neighborhood long enough." Sarah's next stop was Bob Whitmore. She found him in his garage, tinkering with his vintage Mustang. Clearly his escape from the chaos inside his house. Mr. Whitmore, I'm investigating your wife's accident for the HOA's insurance company. Can you tell me what you witnessed? Bob's face went pale. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks, watching Karen dig herself deeper into her deception while he remained trapped between loyalty to his wife and his own conscience. I wasn't there when it happened, he said carefully. But you arrived shortly after. Yes, when Derek called the ambulance. What did you see? Bob stared at his hands, motor oil staining his fingertips. I saw Karen on the ground, complaining about her ankle. Sarah studied his body language, noting the way he avoided eye contact. Mr. Whitmore, is there anything else you think I should know? The silence stretched between them. Finally, Bob looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. My wife, she's been very angry with the HOA for a long time, ever since they rejected her for the board position.